This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
Many of us have those stubborn pounds that seem impossible to lose, no matter how good we eat or how hard we work out. My solution is PlushCare. PlushCare is a leading telehealth provider with doctors who are there for you day and night to partner with you in your weight loss journey. They can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Plus, they accept most insurance plans. To get started, visit plushcare.com/weightloss. That's plushcare.com/weightloss.
Hi, and welcome to Amicus. This is Slate's podcast about the law and the courts and the rule of law. I'm Dahlia Lithwick, and that is my beat at the magazine. And also, I have a bad cold. So as we brace for impact as the Supreme Court ends its term and for maximal turbulence on the opinion palooza front, we also had an issue that we've been wanting to tackle on this show for some time, and we just didn't want the term to end without having this conversation first. So listen, religion is really, really, really important to the Roberts Court and to the Republican Party. Religion is why Dobbs talks about the, quote, unborn human being, and why religious website designers have now been given a singular opt-out from providing services to their paying customers. It's why Justice Samuel Alito went to Rome shortly after Dobbs was decided to fret publicly that, quote, religious liberty is under attack in many places because it is dangerous to those who want to hold complete power, end quote. Religion is why Leonard Leo flies an Appeal to Heaven flag. It's why Speaker Mike Johnson also flies an Appeal to Heaven flag. Oh, and it's also why Martha Ann Alito flies an Appeal to Heaven flag. Religion is everywhere in the American legal discourse, but only one side is really comfortable talking about it. Mark Meadows and his Stop the Steal pen pal, Ginny Thomas, were happily writing about, quote, evil always looks like the victor until the King of Kings triumphs, end quote. The former president screens a video called God Made Trump at his rallies. And Project 2025 is teeming with theological ideas. Extreme religionists are very, very comfortable talking about extreme religion amongst themselves, even if the rest of us have been slow to recognize and name that pattern in political conversation. Denialism about religious fundamentalism has persisted in politics and media at the same time that the separation of church and state has been under assault in the courts in an effort to impose religious extremism on huge majorities of the country. Joining us this week to discuss the ways in which these very fringe religious notions, from Seven Mountains Dominionism to the New Apostolic Reformation, it's all here, it's all coded, and we just need to talk about it. And so we have Rachel Lazar, the president and CEO at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a nonprofit educational advocacy organization that works in courts, legislatures, and the public square to protect religious freedom, and Katherine Stewart, an author and journalist who's been covering religious nationalism and the assault on American democracy for over 15 years. Her most recent book is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It came out in paperback in 2022 and was the inspiration for the recent documentary God and Country. Her forthcoming book, Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Dismantle American Democracy, will be published by Bloomsbury next February. So, Rachel and Katherine, I'm so thrilled to have you here. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Okay, so Katherine, I think we're going to start with you, and we're going to talk about this movement. And I would love to define it because we put a lot under this rubric of white Christian nationalism. So are Dominionism and the New Apostolic Reformation, are those that? Are they different? Are they the same? What do they mean? And how do you define this political movement that we tend to shorthand as Christian nationalism.
Let's talk about what Christian nationalism is and what it isn't. Christian nationalism is not a religion. It's not Christianity. It's, I think of it as a mindset and also machine. The mindset is this ideology, the idea of America as essentially a Christian theocracy or a Christian nation whose laws should be based on the Bible, a very reactionary reading of the Bible. But it's more than that. It's also a political movement, a movement that exploits religion in this organized quest for power. So as a political movement, it is leadership driven and it's organization driven. And it has this deeply networked organizational infrastructure that is really the key to its power. There's been 5 decades of investment in this infrastructure. And it's the leaders of this network who are really calling the shots. We can group their organizations into categories. And I'm going to throw out a few names, but this is by no means comprehensive. So there are these right-wing policy groups like the Family Research Council. You have networking organizations like the Council for National Policy, which gets much of the movement's leadership cadre on the same page and brings them together with these very deep-pocketed funders. There are think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation. And important for this conversation, there's a vast right-wing legal advocacy ecosystem that includes groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom with its $100+ million a year budget, Beckett, Liberty Council, First Liberty Institute, Pacific Justice Institute. There are these legal advocacy groups. There are others involved, and they align with the aims of the Federalist Society and related organizations, which you've written about at length and which mobilize enormous sums of money to shape the courts. And I think another feature of this movement that is often overlooked is the pastor networks like Watchmen on the Wall and Church United or groups like Faith Wins that draw together and then mobilize tens of thousands of conservative or conservative-leaning pastors. Movement leaders know if you can get the pastors, you can get their congregations, because often pastors are the most trusted voices in their congregations. So they reach out to these pastors, draw them into networks, and give them tools to turn out their congregations to vote for the far-right candidates that they want. And then, of course, there's this information sphere or propaganda sphere of the type that the Alitos, with their appeal to heaven flag, are clearly tied into. It's a kind of messaging sphere that outsiders often simply don't know about, but it's incredibly self-contained and repeats over and over again a certain core set of messages.
And Rachel, I think we know a lot about the ways in which these movements and groups sort of have targeted the Congress and targeted the executive branch, right? We have seen, the laying on of hands of the clergy when Donald Trump assumed office. We know a lot about Mike Johnson. We know a lot about Marjorie Taylor Greene and the ways in which these religious ideas have embedded themselves in the other 2 branches of government. But it's harder, I think, murkier to understand how it intersects with the courts. And I would love for you, this is your beat, not mine, to explain to me when it is this movement really turns its attention to the courts and how it is that this movement manages to bring this really sprawling network that Katherine just laid out to sort of direct itself to making change at the federal judiciary.
I think we have to start with the Federalist Society, which was founded in 1982, so over 4 decades ago. And that was around the time when all of the religious right groups were getting active, right? Where they were intentionally shifting their outward focus from school segregation to abortion. And in the late 80s and early 90s is when we saw this shadow network of legal groups really forming with a legal and a court focus, right, that accompanied what the Federalist Society was doing with the judiciary. So the Alliance Defending Freedom was founded in the early 90s, the Beckett Fund in the early 90s, First Liberty in 97, Jay Sekulo's American Center for Law and Justice back in 1990, Liberty Council in 89. So right when we were seeing the moral majority and this sort of burgeoning religious extremist movement in the country, they got really smart and decided to focus on the courts. And boy, are we seeing the rewards of that today.
It's just, Katherine, I'd just love to add that, that's a great summary, Rachel. And the movement was extremely strategic, very, very patient. And I think the key to their success is the long range in their thinking and their strategy. So from the very beginning, they really set about picking the right cases to bring to the right courts and created these novel legal building blocks that would basically sideline and in some cases obliterate the Establishment Clause. They've turned civil rights law on its head and expanded the privileges of religious organizations substantially, including the right to taxpayer money.
And I wonder if, maybe I'll direct this at you, Rachel, but, there's this arc of cases, Katherine just flicked at it, that is sort of building this burgeoning notion of what religious liberty is, and at the same time sort of systematically eroding the wall between church and state. And you can carbon date it at, one of several places, the sort of response to Christian Legal Society versus Martinez in 2010, the majority opinion in Hobby Lobby in 2014, Little Sisters of the Poor, the Cross case. But it seems to me Dobbs is a sort of interesting turning point, because Dobbs comes to us as a case about originalism and precedent and the Constitution, but it's as much about, I think Linda Greenhouse makes this point when it comes down, this is as much a case about religion as it is about reproductive rights.
Very much so. And I think that an older generation really understood that. Like, we have members in their 90s who are older men, who came to the church-state separation issue because they understood that abortion bans impose one narrow religious viewpoint on all of us, right? And prevent us from making our own decisions about our own bodies according to our own religious beliefs. Justice Sotomayor pointed that out during the Dobbs oral argument. She said to the Solicitor General for Mississippi, "How is your interest anything but a religious view? When you say abortion is the only right that takes away from the state the ability to protect a life, that's a religious view, isn't it?" And honestly, he didn't have anything good to say in response, because it is. That's one way to sort of answer that question. Yes, it is very much about religion. I think it used to be that religious extremists buried the religious motivation for their bans. But today, religious extremists are so emboldened, right, that Supreme Court justices are flying Christian nationalist movement flags from their vacation homes and blaming it on their wives. If you look at the term that Dobbs was decided in, because I think that's like a really nice microcosm to portray what's going on. In that single term 2 years ago, we had the court impose one narrow religious view on everyone by overturning Roe v. Wade, force the city of Boston to fly the Christian flag from its official government flagpole against its will, force a school district, a public school district, to allow a public school, high school coach to pressure players to pray at the 50-yard line after football games, right? And fall for this deceitful narrative. That's what the lower courts called it, that was somehow private and personal prayer. And force a state, the state of Maine, to have taxpayers fund religious indoctrination, a state that was trying to distinguish between private school vouchers going to private schools that were non-religious and keep to their constitutional commitment to have public funds not fund religion. But no, the court forced the state of Maine to do so. Think about that in one term, what happened, right? And I think that's where we are today, the imposition of religion. And the most backwards part of it, other than the fact that the government is doing it and undermining church-state separation, is that they're doing it in the name of religious freedom, right? Just think of how backwards that is. Basically, imposing one narrow kind of most powerful type of religion in America on everyone, taking away the majority of our religious freedom.
Let's pause now to hear from some of our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. There's a new game-changing product to use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/amicus to get 15% off your first order when you use Amicus at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/amicus and use the code amicus at checkout for 15% off. Let's get back to my conversation with Rachel Lazar of Americans United and author and journalist Katherine Stewart about the rise and the rise of the religious right. Katherine, my follow-on question to you is just based on a piece that you wrote that, the hair on the back of my neck stood up in 2022 when you wrote this piece saying, after Dobbs, the moment gets supercharged, right? There isn't take the win and, go mildly into the sunset. And what you said, you flagged sort of three things that happened after Dobbs. And I just want to read it because I think this is evocative of the moment that we're in 2 short years later. You wrote, first, the rhetoric of violence among movement leaders appears to have increased significantly from the already alarming levels I had observed in previous years. Second, the theology of Dominionism, that is the belief that right-thinking Christians have a biblically derived mandate to take control of all aspects of government and society, is now explicitly embraced. And third, the movement's key strategists were giddy about the legal arsenal that the Supreme Court had laid at their feet as they anticipated the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I just want to give you the opportunity to, in a really fulsome way, explain that those three themes that you clocked post-Dobbs, so an uptick in violence, an uptick in this dominionist notion that you have a responsibility to seize power and control all parts of government and society, and that three, everything is now on the table. I mean, we live in that world. That's mifepristone, right? That's EMTALA. That is the in vitro fertilization decision out of the Alabama Supreme Court. So I would love for you to just help us understand, because I don't know that shift was visible to all of us, what it is that you saw and how it's played out in, as I said, the 2 very short years since Dobbs.
Those 3 features have played out in a number of ways. I mean, I would say, for one thing, Dobbs provides a blueprint for selectively depriving one sex, women, of rights that the other sex, men, possess and are not threatened. So by acknowledging the legitimacy of a state interest in zygotes and blastocysts and fetuses, they really provide a legal system with a set of purely religiously grounded rights that can be used to strip women of all kinds of rights and basically turn our bodies and lives over to federal and state authorities. But I want to say that Dobbs is really just the inevitable consequence of this movement's power. They're not stopping here. The movement leaders are determined to end all abortion access everywhere. When they say abortion, they also mean some of the most effective and popular forms of birth control, as well as miscarriage care that's necessary to save women's lives and health. And frankly, we're seeing the consequence of these devastating cases where women, listen, pregnancy, it's not a walk in the park. As someone whose life was saved personally, my life was saved by an abortion that I needed in order to preserve my life. I mean, we're seeing the consequences of this all over the country, where women are suffering devastating health consequences when they can't get the miscarriage care that they need. I've been attending right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings for 15 years, really, for my research, and they tell us over and over again what they intend to do, and then they do it, and then they boast about what they've done. They're really not hiding, and their aims are not hard to discern if you're paying attention. And you mentioned a sort of rhetoric of violence. Yes, in the last, 15 years, the rhetoric of violence has become more extreme, sort of harder and hotter than it was certainly 10 years ago. 15 years ago, the religious right sometimes wanted to portray itself as just wanting a seat at the table in the noisy form of American democracy. We just want to have our voices heard and be counted too. But the calls for dominion, the calls for total domination have become louder and more explicit. And part of that is a consequence of the rise of these, I would call it like a spirit warrior style of religion embodied in movements like the New Apostolic Reformation, which is a sort of charismatic Christian evangelical movement. It's a relational network rather than a formal denomination. And it's grown enormously in recent years. It has deep roots in Christian Reconstructionism and Calvinism, but it didn't really get going until when Lauren Cunningham and Bill Bright, these two Christian right leaders, both said they had a dream. It was prior to 2000. They both seemed to have the same dream, that God told them that they needed to take over the 7 mountains or spheres of culture, which they identified as things like government, education, business, media, and the like. And they said they need to do this in order to sort of dominate the 7 peaks of society. And they sort of shared these ideas with some figures like Lance Wallnau. And then this fellow named C. Peter Wagner, he was a key figure in church planting movements, or the movement of establishing or planting new churches. He sort of ran with it, cast the idea of taking over the 7 mountains as taking back dominion from Satan. And so that sort of notion of 7 mountains dominionism has really spread very quickly, not just among networks like the New Apostolic Reformation and other charismatic networks, but the language and style of 7 mountains dominionism and this sort of spirit warrior religion has spread to other sectors of the movement that are not remotely identified with the NAR or charismatic Christianity. So you have people like Mike Flynn or Roger Stone, they identify as Catholic. They're talking about demonic portals and spiritual warfare, or talking about the 7 mountains of culture, using the kind of terminology and imagery of charismatic Christianity. NAR churches often cite the Watchman Decree, which references the 7 mountains. It's this very theocratic prayer that they say, and they often fly that appeal to heaven flag. Well, now you have people like Mike Johnson, who's affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, displaying an appeal to heaven flag outside his office and appearing on podcasts run by very overt 7 mountains dominionists. And, you have a lot of white power and militia groups that were not particularly religious before. They were more focused on race, but now they're adopting the language and style of 7 mountains dominionism. So, when you see Mike Johnson's appeal to heaven flag, or when you see the Alitos flying the appeal to heaven flag, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily affiliated with the New Apostolic Reformation or that they're members of these militias at all. But it really tells us who they've been talking to. Look, most people in the mainstream of the center right really don't know anything about this flag. They wouldn't think to fly it. It's like a relic of the revolutionary period, and it's been revived now, and it's being promoted by people on the extreme far right. So when they fly it, they've reinterpreted it as taking a stand for the idea of America as a Christian, theocratic nation rather than a pluralistic democracy. It's an incredibly, it's a very un-American idea. They see it as a call for profound and even violent revolution. And it's really astonishing to see it flying over the Alito's beach house. Again, it doesn't mean that they're paid up members of militia groups or charismatic Christian groups. It just means they spend their time in the same information and propaganda bubbles where this flag stands for God and country and armed insurrection.
This is Rachel. I'll just add one thing, that if you believe that rights are God-given instead of given by the people, then you can see how you can jump quickly to, and I can use violence to protect those rights. And that's what has showed up in the polls, right? So PRRI did a poll on Christian nationalists, and what they found is that Christian nationalists are about twice as likely as the rest of us to believe in violence, political violence, right? That's what we saw on January 6th at the insurrection, right? With the parading Appeal to Heaven flags that were at the insurrection and the Jesus Saves flags and the like. And I think another important point to make here is the authoritarian nature of this Christian nationalist movement, right? This movement is rooted in the belief that America is a country given to European Christians and that our laws and policies must reflect the same, right? And if you believe that, you are anti-democratic because democracy is rooted in equality. So the end goal of this Christian nationalist movement has to be the toppling of democracy to achieve their goal. And that's why we saw so many of them fueling the insurrection. And one more point to make here. The antidote to Christian nationalism is the separation of church and state, because it refuses to let Christianity and Christian privilege into the law, conservative Christianity, be sort of the guiding principle in America. It insists that America keep to its promises that are embedded in our Constitution of religious freedom as a basic human right. And that's why Christian nationalists have gone after the separation of church and state. And that's why their allies at the Supreme Court are basically attacking, they're on a crusade to eradicate church-state separation, right? To deny its very existence in this country, which as a foundation of our democracy, for that very reason, because they are in lockstep with a movement that must get rid of church-state separation in order to accomplish its goals.
It occurs to me as you're talking, Rachel, that of course the other fix for religious, Christian religious nationalism is public education, which is, of course, another target of this movement, because that's right. That's the other way that you can undermine this. And it certainly explains, as you said initially, the assaults on public education that are coming from the same court that has a member flying this flag. And I do want to really reinforce the point that you just made there about if you in fact believe that the United States is a sort of covenantal gift from God to white Christians, it does explain the willingness to use violence to achieve whatever ends you seek to achieve. Because clearly, right, that's God's law has to be predominant. And, coda here, to my two codas, the gun groups see gun rights as given by God, right? I mean, this is all of a piece. And so this tilting into condoning political violence, being a part of January 6th, right? There was a lot of religious iconography at January 6th and following January 6th. This tilting into a comfort with violence is very, very predictable. But Katherine, I wonder if you would just unpack it for us for one more beat, because it does seem as though some of what we are seeing now that was a sort of a fringy resort to violence is not fringy at all anymore. It's quite mainstream. There seems to be, the ends justifies the means at all costs ethos now.
That's true. I mean, the core messages of Christian nationalism include catastrophism, the idea that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, we're on the edge of the apocalypse because of secular liberals and feminists. They often cast anyone to the left of them as demonic and satanic, communists, etc. And they say that dramatic measures are really necessary to save us. So, then there's, of course, that persecution narrative. They say that there's no group more at risk of annihilation than white, conservative, right-thinking Christians. And they feel like they're entitled to rule because they represent the true America, the authentic America. And that leads to the idea that we need a strong man, someone who's going to break the rules because the rules are broken and only a tough guy can save us. So it's interesting. It's a kind of identity politics, isn't it? The right is always accusing the left of identity politics, but they play it much harder. And this anti-democratic mindset always gravitates around the figure of a strongman. Again, this idea is you need a guy who's going to cut through all the legalisms and bureaucracy and break the rules and crack heads as long as those heads belong to his enemies. And Trump really fits the bill in this way. I mean, when he hears rhetoric of violence from his supporters, he doesn't say anything to stop it. He provides a kind of permission structure for it to continue and intensify, and he echoes it. I remember a couple of speeches I've seen him say. He repeats, the most dangerous enemy we face, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, is not the enemy from abroad. It's not our foreign enemies. The most dangerous enemy we face is the enemy within. And you know who we're talking about. He's talking about anyone to the left of him, or rhinos, or anyone who opposes him. I think Trump filled those sort of strongman shoes in many ways that people didn't think possible in the American context. But again, this movement is much bigger than him. It long preceded him. He just really managed to exploit it and give it rocket fuel through the courts and through policy and through his rhetoric, breaking all these norms. He owes his political career to this movement. And because they turned out the voters on his behalf. So they're the ones calling the shots. And if he gets back in, he will give them whatever they want.
I think that Katherine just gave us a really good thumbnail of the new apostolic reformation, the NAR. I've heard this week, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center characterized it as the most important political movement that nobody's ever heard of. But I want to talk about this flag for one quick moment, because Katherine makes the important point that it is not necessary for Justice Alito or Martha Ann Alito, whoever flew that flag for over 2 months, right, at the summer home. Whoever flew that flag doesn't have to be a fan of the NAR. They just have to, as Katherine says, sort of be speaking in the coded languages and the symbology and the memes and the winks and the nods of this larger movement. Nobody is saying that, Samuel Alito and Dutch Sheets sup together. But I think what we are saying is that Dutch Sheets, who is, one of the leaders of the movement to create the appeal to heaven symbolism, sort of to take it out of the notion that this was, I think I called it in a piece last week, like a big George Washington foam finger, right? It's just, we love liberty and we love John Locke, and to turn it into something deeply religious. And Dutch Sheets goes to the Supreme Court and prays there and is deeply invested in the Supreme Court as a locus of change, right? He's not just targeting the presidency or the Congress. And I think that this move, Rachel, I think your colleague, Andrew Seidel at Americans United, called it a sort of secret handshake, this flag, with plausible deniability, right? It doesn't have to mean the thing that you know it to mean for it to be deeply alarming that the Alitos are flying it for weeks on end over their home.
Deeply alarming. And even if you think about ethics and the Supreme Court, and you think about common law ethics, right? Because there wasn't even this code that was issued for the Supreme Court ethics until November of 2023, right? But that code recognizes that most of its rules derive from these common law ethics. And one of the basics in common law ethics for judges is that they need to avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. And no matter what you say about how closely affiliated Justice Alito is with the movement, because who knows, right? Who really knows, right? You can't jump to conclusions, but you can certainly say that there's an appearance of impropriety in flying that new symbol of the Christian nationalist movement in front of their vacation home, period.
This is Katherine. And I also want to add, that we didn't really need this flag to know that Alito lives in this information bubble because it's evident from his other behaviors. I mean, if you listen to his questions, and I think it's Trump versus Anderson, it's the Colorado case where the U.S. Supreme Court decided to ignore the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and overturn the Colorado Supreme Court's decision disqualifying Trump. If you listen to Alito's questions, they seem motivated by, it's like an unstated, but it's clearly discernible, this belief that Trump is the victim of political persecution. I mean, that alone, without the flag, will tell you just what kind of world Alito is living in, what kind of information world he's living in. And that's the message of this flag. Even though he wouldn't have marched alongside the January 6th insurrectionists who flew the flag, he is nonetheless simpatico, I would say, sort of with their grievance or with their cause.
And this is Rachel. Here's something else to say about the flag. When Alito wrote his concurrence in the Christian flag case that I described earlier, Shurtleff, he wrote, and I quote, "As the court rightly notes, a passerby on Cambridge Street confronted with a flag flanked by government flags standing just outside the entrance of Boston's seat of government would likely conclude that all of those flags convey some message on the government's behalf." So he has copped to the reality that a flag flying outside of a important place conveys a message, right? So there's just no way around the reality that this symbolism of Christian nationalism would convey a message that he realizes it conveys to the public.
I think Matthew Taylor made the good on one of the shows I was listening to that a flag is not a T-shirt. Like a T-shirt is like a low key, here's a thing I believe. A flag is a very public signaling to the world of a message that you want to convey. It is a profound shift from having a coffee mug.
Yes, and especially an appeal to heaven flag, because it's not like you can just go find an appeal to heaven flag down the block in CVS, like you can probably find an American flag right now that July 4th is approaching, right? Those are flags that you go out of your way to order, right? From the internet or to find a store that has such a flag. They're not easy to find like an American flag. So he made, and his wife and he or whoever made an effort to fly that flag.
Go ahead, Katherine.
I would just want to note that there's this irony that the appeal to heaven phrase comes from John Locke. He was a representative of the English Enlightenment. He was committed to philosophical empiricism or reason. He rejected the idea of a king's divine right to rule. I mean, if he could see how the meaning of his words have been twisted and repurposed, he'd be rolling in his grave.
Can we talk for one brief minute? Because Katherine makes this really important point about how the effort to have Justice Alito recuse from the two January 6 cases, Fisher and the Trump immunity case, is really bound up in the ways in which the appeal to heaven flag shows up on January 6th. But I think under that, Katherine, you're both making this point, which is the appeal to heaven flag raises real questions about the religion cases on the docket. It's not just about the notion that maybe the 2020 election was stolen. And I would like to hear one or both of you just comment on the fact that there are two abortion cases that are pending at this court. And in my view, that appeal to heaven flag is a signifier that Justice Alito has theological views in matters that are deeply theological that have to do with women's reproductive freedoms.
So this is Rachel. I have to say that we already know that Justice Alito is imposing one religious viewpoint and his religious viewpoint on the country from him writing the majority opinion in the Dobbs decision, right? Where in the opening and closing of that decision, he calls abortion a moral issue. So if abortion is a moral issue and morality means everybody's religious freedom, then you can't impose one religious viewpoint on everyone and overrule Roe v. Wade. But instead, he leaps from it being a moral issue to subjecting the entire country to one narrow religious viewpoint on abortion, his, right? Which is that abortion is a sin, basically, right? And of course, the Dobbs decision doesn't use religious language, but some of the laws around the country are. And I also wanted to make that point, right? Americans United brought a lawsuit in Missouri challenging their abortion ban on behalf of 14 clergy from 7 different religious denominations, where the lawmakers inserted their religious beliefs into the law. In the law, they wrote that Almighty God is the author of life. The authors of the abortion ban spoke to their personal religious motivations for wanting to ban abortion for everyone in their state. And that's the world we're living in today, where at least 20 years ago, when I was growing up, religious extremists had the manners to hide the religious motivations for their bans on abortion, efforts to ban contraception, which we haven't really spoken enough about today, but that's sort of next on the horizon. And Clarence Thomas told us so in the Dobbs concurrence that he wrote as well, right? And confusing birth control for abortion and everything else, right? But that's the world we're living in today, where religious extremists are raging so hard and finding so much progress with this 7-mountain government mandate, right? Where instead of demons, indeed, we are seeing conservative Christianity dominate, across the states. Almost half the states have abortion bans now, right? That is religious extremism. Catherine, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And I'd like to point out that another huge area where the courts are going to impose religion is through school-related cases. Thanks to groundwork of the Christian nationalist movement's far-right legal apparatus, the Supreme Court has been laying the groundwork for the creation of publicly funded networks of religious schools and also ideologically right-wing schools through cases like Carson versus Macon and Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue, and even sort of linchpin of my first book, Good News Club versus Milford Central School, which came out back in 2001. The religious right has a long-standing hostility to public education because of its pluralism, but we're already moving toward a world in which public education is replaced by private education in the hands of highly profitable charter networks. But we're also getting, through vouchers, taxpayer-funded religious schools and even efforts to fully fund religious charters. I just came back from a very large homeschooling conference. They want to take public money and give it to the, most sort of reactionary religious folks who don't believe that their kids should attend school at all and advocate for strict homeschooling so they can bring up their children in a godly way, but they want to do it at taxpayer expense. Now, homeschooling, of course, is a big tent. It draws in all kinds of families, religious and non-religious alike. But the homeschooling movement is kind of dominated by a sort of Christian nationalist sector. Michael P. Ferris, who was the former president of the Alliance Defending Freedom and founded the HSLD, it stands for Homeschool Legal Defense Association, I think. He has played an outsized role in the homeschooling movement. It's extremely hostile to public education. They call public schools government schools, and they would be happy to destroy them. And when you go to their conferences, homeschooling conferences, you'll hear keynote speakers talk about destroying the system of public education, slaying the beast, as they say. This is already happening in Florida, by the way, where DeSantis has boasted that he's the epicenter of school choice. It's a sort of, we all like our choices, right? It sounds really nice, but they give $8,000 a year per child to homeschoolers to sort of supplement for teaching materials. And, that sounds great. They're also devoting a lot of money to often charter networks, often started by people with religious or right-wing ideological agendas. But a consequence is the underfunded public schools are shuttering their doors at a breathtaking pace. And the Supreme Court is really laying the ground for this by weaponizing religious freedom arguments. I think it's hard to believe they get away with it, but the argument is essentially that failing to use taxpayer money to support religion, that's your money and mine, they say that's a violation of the free speech rights of religious people. It's a kind of up is down argument, but it's, in fact, the guiding ideology of not just Thomas and Alito, but also Gorsuch and possibly Kavanaugh and Barrett. We'll have to see.
We're going to take a short break.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Ah, the sizzle of McDonald's sausage. It's enough to make you crave your favorite breakfasts. Enough to head over to McDonald's. Enough to make you really wish this commercial were scratch and sniff.
And if you're a sausage person, now get 2 satisfyingly savory sausage McGriddles, sausage biscuits, or sausage burritos for just $3.33. Or mix and match. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer or combo meal. Single item at regular price.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
More now on Christian nationalism and its influence on the courts, the law, the Supreme Court, and the future of democracy. I think I just want to ask a question that's a follow-on to something Katherine said earlier about Donald Trump, because in 2016, the vibe was Cyrus, right? Trump is the imperfect leader. Sure, he's had a bunch of divorces and he may or may not have paid money to a porn star, but, you know, he's going to bring on this messianic age. That has torqued really quickly into Trump worship, right? Trump himself as like quasi-Christ-like, Eric Trump claiming that his father literally saved Christianity, the image of Donald Trump posted on Truth Social of Jesus sitting next to him at trial. I would be very curious, and I think you've both talked about anger and fury and a sense that Donald Trump is a guy who's just willing to just make it happen. But I would love to hear your reflections on how Trump went from being a sort of imperfect messenger of God to being something like awfully close to a Christ-like figure in a very brief amount of time. Katherine, do you want to go?
I think it's a sad fact, right? But we have to accept that Trump's criminal activity, his sexual abuse, his in-the-face misogyny, these things fundamentally help more than hurt his position with his base. It's because this movement is hugely dependent on reactionary attitudes toward gender roles, and there are more and more overt calls for the submission of women and the virtues of a certain macho model of manliness, and he really embodies that. For his followers, it's often part of his strongman appeal. And anything they really don't like, they have, of course, the forgiveness of sin and redemption. So I think that's a big part of it. But I think it really shows that propaganda works. You know, as part of my research, I go to these Reawaken America events. You guys know what they are? These, oh my gosh, you're missing out. Reawaken America is a traveling conspiracist roadshow, super pro-Trump, like Eric Trump often speaks at them, Mike Flynn, Roger Stone, and they draw together conspiracists of the most sort of virulent kind. They're talking about, every sort of conspiracy you've ever heard. QAnon, JFK conspiracies, one world government, the Rothschilds, Soros, whatever, COVID misinformation, etc. You're going to hear all of this stuff and more. And it's not clear that every single person who attends these gatherings, they attract thousands of people, by the way. They usually take place in mega churches. And there's a lot of religious nationalist rhetoric at these gatherings. But the one overarching conspiracy that they are all led to believe in is the idea that Trump is a savior. He's an incredibly good guy. He's one of the white hats battling the black hats. He's here to save us. And his opponents are satanic, demonic, under the control of the devil and most despicable human beings imaginable. And they want to take all your freedoms away, seize all your money, and change your gender against your will and microchip you. I mean, you're going to hear this kind of stuff. People say this with a straight face from the main stage. And, it just shows that misinformation works. And, I've spoken to some of these folks at these gatherings. A lot of them are not bad people. They've just been so deeply misinformed and drawn into these worlds of disinformation, these disinformation bubbles. It's very hard to shake them from.
This is Rachel. I would just say that Christian nationalism is a political ideology. It's a cultural construct. I work every day with Christian leaders, and none of the Christian leaders that I work with view Christian nationalism as remotely related to Christianity. Right. So everything about Christian nationalism defies what they believe is Jesus-like. Right. So if you have a movement that's really set up to achieve political ends and cultural ends, then sure, they're going to continue to hold up the person who they are in this powerful transactional relationship with and getting so much from as Christ-like, because he's fulfilling their end goals, which for many Christians are not Christian end goals.
Can we end on Project 2025? Rachel Rachel is now holding her head in despair. Rachel made the point that we should be talking about contraception and the vote that happened this week in the Senate. Project 2025, I know listeners of this show know about it. It's a sort of blueprint for what happens if Trump or a Republican gets elected. And it's a product of, the Heritage Foundation, but Hillsdale College, Liberty University, Claremont Institute, Turning Point USA, right? This is, again, I think Katherine said, and this is so true, this is not about NAR. This is about a huge sprawling web, making common cause with one another. And maybe, Rachel, we'll start with you and just talk about, my intro to this show was one side is incredibly comfortable putting this in black and white and telling us what's coming. And our side seems to be very anxious about talking about it, engaging with it, thinking about it, calling it out. And I would just love for you to just give me your reflections on what it means that we have an openly theological, paternalistic, misogynistic, anti-LGBTQ, anti-education, anti-government project that is being promised to us. And it's not like A1 front page news for a lot of voters who care about those issues.
The reality that the religious extremist movement is this emboldened, that they would print a 900-page playbook for restructuring the federal government in order to accomplish the policy goals of this white Christian nationalist agenda is horrifying. It shows where we are as a country. And I think you're right, Dahlia, that there is this resistance to talk about it, to talk about the religious aspects of it. In America, we have this can't touch this attitude towards religion. We deeply respect religion, and it's a really cool feature of America. It actually encourages religion to flourish and thrive in this country because no one's having religion shoved down their throat, and because the government isn't sullying religion by making requirements of it. So there are all these great things about religion, but we should talk about the religious extremists who are threatening our democracy today, because we need to recommit to separating religion and government in order to protect America and in order to protect even religion across this country before it's too late. So the very fact that they've printed this and put this out sort of shows all of us where we are today. They are for rolling back the rights of LGBTQ people, ending marriage equality, banning abortion and limiting reproductive health care, erecting roadblocks to racial justice, eliminating the Department of Education, diverting public funds to private religious schools, redefining religious freedom as a license to discriminate. And it goes on and on. It is an extremist agenda, and not just extremist, it's religious extremist.
Last word to you, Katherine. Project 2025.
I think it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around this because the rhetoric is so anti-democratic and frankly un-American that people frankly tell stories to themselves in order to make themselves feel more comfortable and to reassure themselves that this can't really happen, that it can't happen here. But this movement is not hiding. We're not listening. We need to pay attention to what movement leaders say, and we need to take them at their word.
Rachel Lazar is president and CEO at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a nonprofit educational and advocacy organization that works in courts, legislatures, and the public square to protect religious freedom. Katherine Stewart is an author and a journalist who's been covering religious nationalism and the assault on American democracy for over 15 years. Her most recent book is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. It came out in paperback in 2022. Her forthcoming book, Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Dismantle American Democracy, will be published by Bloomsbury next February. Rachel, Katherine, this was unbelievably illuminating, and I really want to thank you for all the work you do in this space. And I hope we'll have you back to talk about it more in the future.
Thank you so much. This was fun for a very depressing topic.
Thank you so much.
If you are a Slate Plus listener, I will see you at the Amicus After Party. Our bonus episode for Amicus Plus subscribers is available right now for you to listen to. Mark Joseph Stern and I discuss the lawsuit being brought by two professors at the University of Texas in Austin who would like to make sure they can penalize students who have to travel out of state to access abortion care. If this episode with Katherine Stewart and Rachel Lazar was the Christian Nationalism shot, this week's Plus episode is The Chaser. You can sign up for Slate Plus membership now to access that conversation by going to slate.com/Amicus Plus, or if you're listening in Apple Podcasts, just click Try Free at the top of our show page. And one more thing to keep in mind, Slate Plus members get access to all of our Opinion Palooza content that will be coming thick and fast over the month of June. So slate.com/Amicus Plus, and you will not miss a thing. Also, to our listeners who are Plus members, thank you so much for supporting the work that we do. And that is a wrap for this week's episode of Amicus. Thank you so much for listening in. Thank you so very much for your letters and your questions and your feedback. You can keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer with help from Patrick Fort. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio at Slate. Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor, and Ben Richmond is our senior director of operations. We will be back with another episode of Amicus next week, and until then, hang on in there.